The morning the school bus ended up stuck sideways on our snow-packed hill was the moment I realized this was no longer just a drama. This had turned into a real emergency. I was standing in my driveway in Coldwater Ridge, Wyoming, staring at my silent snowplow truck, when my phone started exploding with calls. Parents were shouting over each other. A dispatcher sounded close to panic, and somewhere just up the road, a bright yellow school bus sat helpless, tires spinning uselessly in deep snow, kids trapped inside and getting colder by the minute, all because the HOA president had ordered me to stop plowing. My name is Ethan Hale. For more than a decade, I had been the reason our mountain roads stayed alive during winter. Ambulances made it through. Seniors got their medicine. Kids made it to school. When storms hit before dawn, my truck was already moving. But Marla Jennings, the new HOA president, decided my snowplow did not fit her luxury alpine image. She fined me. She threatened liens on my home. She sent official letters warning me to stay off HOA-controlled roads. So I did exactly what she told me to do. I stopped plowing. And less than 2 days later, the entire neighborhood turned into an ice cage. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Coldwater Ridge did not used to be complicated. It was the kind of mountain neighborhood where people waved even if they did not know your name, where most of the houses had been standing longer than the rules meant to govern them. Old log cabins sat next to modest ranch homes. Retired couples lived beside working families like mine. Everyone understood one basic truth about living up here: winter was not a design choice. It was a force. You did not decorate around it or pretend it was charming. You prepared for it, or you paid for that mistake. I moved to Coldwater Ridge in my late 20s with more optimism than money. I bought a rundown place that most people overlooked, patched it together one paycheck at a time, and learned quickly that snow removal was not optional if you wanted to survive. I started plowing driveways for neighbors just to cover bills. At first it was informal. A handshake, a thank you. Sometimes a hot cup of coffee handed through a cracked door at dawn. Over the years, that side work grew into something bigger. When storms hit at 3 in the morning, I was already outside warming up the truck. When roads vanished overnight, I was the one cutting the first path through. People depended on that, even if they did not always say it out loud. Ambulances made it through because I cleared access early. Seniors got to medical appointments. Parents could get their kids down the mountain without white-knuckle drives. The school district quietly planned routes around the fact that my truck existed. Nobody called it heroic. It was just how things worked. Back then, the HOA barely registered in anyone's life. Dues were low enough that most people forgot about them. Meetings were held in living rooms or garages, and they felt more like neighborhood gatherings than governing bodies. Someone always brought chili. Someone else complained about potholes. The roads were technically private, but the understanding was simple: if snow piled up, whoever could clear it did. Rules bent when safety demanded it. That balance held for years. Then Marla Jennings moved in. She came from out of state, bought the biggest house on the ridge without ever spending a winter here, and introduced herself like she was stepping onto a stage. She talked about standards and long-term value in a way that sounded polished but hollow. Within weeks, she was pointing out things nobody had ever cared about before. Fences were suddenly the wrong shade. Mailboxes were suddenly non-compliant. Decorative rules appeared that seemed designed more for control than improvement. Most people shrugged it off at first. Every HOA has someone like that, right? Someone who needs a project. But Marla did not stop at appearances. She showed up at meetings with binders. She talked about restructuring. She pushed for elections during times when half the neighborhood was out of town or working. The old board, made up of people who had lived here for decades, slowly disappeared. They did not fight it. They assumed common sense would eventually win. It did not. New bylaws appeared, mailed in thick envelopes that few people actually read. The language was dense, full of clauses and subclauses that looked harmless on the surface. Buried inside were new restrictions about vehicles, noise, and commercial activity. Most residents did not think it applied to them, so they signed nothing and said nothing. That was when Marla shifted her focus. She started noticing trucks. Anything with a ladder rack, anything with toolboxes, anything with a logo or equipment mount. She framed it as protecting aesthetics, but the pattern was obvious. Work did not belong in her version of Coldwater Ridge. Only the appearance of leisure did. My snowplow stuck out like a flare. It was parked on my property, but it was visible. It had a blade. It had lights. It looked like work, and to Marla that made it a problem. She started mentioning it casually at meetings, like she was just asking questions. Then came the emails, then the warnings. She talked about setting precedent, as if clearing snow for neighbors was some kind of moral failure. What bothered me most was how quickly fear spread. Neighbors who used to chat freely suddenly went quiet when Marla walked by. People who relied on my plowing stopped mentioning it publicly. Nobody wanted to be next. The HOA that once barely existed had turned into something sharp, edged, and watchful. And the worst part was this: Marla had no plan to replace what she was trying to eliminate. There was no contracted snow service, no backup, no emergency provision. She assumed the mountain would bend to her paperwork. She believed rules mattered more than reality. By the time winter clouds started stacking low over the ridge again, my snowplow was no longer just a truck to her. It was a symbol she needed to crush. And everyone else was about to find out what happens when you let someone who has never pushed a shovel decide how a mountain community survives. The first warning showed up tucked neatly under my windshield wiper, written in polite language that almost sounded apologetic. It thanked me for my cooperation and gently reminded me that the HOA had recently updated its policies regarding commercial vehicles. I remember reading it twice, confused more than angry. I lived here. This was my home. The truck was parked on my own property. I figured it was a misunderstanding that would clear up with a short conversation. The second notice arrived a week later, this time folded inside an official-looking envelope and stamped with urgency. The tone had changed. Bold lettering, a dollar amount printed in black ink that made my stomach tighten. It was a fine already assessed for violating the same vague rule. Still, I told myself it was fixable. People make mistakes. Paperwork gets misinterpreted. By the third letter, there was no room left for doubt. Marla quoted bylaws I had never seen, let alone voted on, claiming my snowplow truck violated commercial activity restrictions. She wrote like a judge issuing a ruling, not a neighbor trying to solve a problem. That was when I realized this was not confusion. It was intentional. I asked for a meeting, face to face. I wanted to talk like adults. When I sat across from her, I laid everything out calmly. I told her I lived in Coldwater Ridge, that I was not running some outside business through the neighborhood. I plowed driveways for neighbors who asked me to. I cleared access when storms hit so people could get out. I reminded her that the HOA had no contracted snow service and never had. That emergency vehicles depended on the roads being passable long before any county crew could even reach us. She listened without interrupting, hands folded neatly, a small smile on her face that never reached her eyes. Then she slid a printed sheet across the table and called it a solution. If I wanted to keep my truck in the neighborhood, she said, I could apply for a special permit. The permit came with a large upfront security deposit, a monthly fee, and additional charges, subject to review. The numbers were staggering. Even if I worked nonstop all winter, I would barely break even. One slow month would wipe me out completely. She framed it as fairness, as compromise. I recognized it immediately for what it was. It was not regulation. It was a financial chokehold. I told her I could not agree to it, that it would destroy my livelihood, that it made no sense to punish the one person actually keeping the roads safe. Her smile vanished. From that moment on, the situation escalated fast. The warnings turned into threats. The threats turned into deadlines. Letters started arriving by certified mail, each one heavier than the last, each one reminding me that liens were an option if I continued to defy the board. She CC'd lawyers. She used language meant to intimidate, not inform. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was early, still dark, the kind of cold where the air hurts your lungs. Snow had been falling steadily since before dawn. I fired up the truck, like I always did, and headed toward the main road to start clearing before people needed to leave. I barely made it 50 yards before I saw her SUV. She had parked it sideways across the road, blocking the entire lane. Hazard lights flashing, phone already in her hand. She did not yell. She did not argue. She just stood there filming, narrating calmly as if she were documenting a crime scene. Every time I shifted the truck or adjusted the blade, she announced another violation, another fine, another entry for the file. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding, staring at the wall she had created out of nothing but ego and paperwork. If I pushed past her, she would claim harassment or property damage. If I stayed, the snow would keep piling up behind me. I thought about my mortgage, about the letters threatening liens, about how easily a legal fight could bury me, even if I was right. So I did the one thing that made sense in the moment. I backed up. I turned the truck around and went home. At the time, it felt like retreating to survive. What I did not realize yet was that by forcing me off the road, Marla had just removed the last thing holding the neighborhood together during winter. That single moment, on that frozen morning, cost Coldwater Ridge far more than any fine ever could. At first, most people thought I was bluffing. They assumed I was making a point, trying to scare the HOA into backing down, and that I would eventually cave and start plowing again like I always had. That belief lasted exactly as long as the next storm. The snow did not stop. It came down slow and steady, the kind that looks harmless until you realize it never lets up. Overnight, tire tracks vanished. By morning, the roads were nothing but smooth white slopes with no edges, no shoulders, and no room for error. Driveways disappeared completely. Cars that tried to leave ended up sideways, wheels spinning, engines whining in frustration. I stayed home. Not because I wanted to, because I had been ordered to. The calls started trickling in, cautious at first. Neighbors asking if I knew when the new plow service would arrive. Others hinting that maybe I could just clear a little bit quietly like before. I told them all the same thing, as calmly as I could. I had been banned from HOA roads. If I went out there, I risked losing my house. That was when the tone changed. Lillian Brooks called me late one afternoon, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her at first. She lived near the top of the ridge alone and relied on weekly medical transport to get down the mountain. She told me her driver had canceled. The road was impassable. She asked if I could please, just this once, help her get out. Telling her no was one of the hardest things I have ever done. I explained what Marla had done. I told her about the fines, the threats, the blocked road. There was a long silence on the line, and then she started crying. Not angry crying, scared crying. The kind that comes from realizing you are trapped by something you cannot control. Word spread fast after that. People started to understand that this was real. that the truck sitting idle in my driveway was not stubbornness. It was fear, and fear is contagious. Instead of banding together, most neighbors pulled inward. Curtains stayed closed. Phones stopped ringing. Nobody wanted to be the next name on Marla's list. Anyone who did speak up paid for it immediately. A couple on the lower loop questioned the lack of snow removal in an email thread. They were fined for hostile communication. A retired man asked at a meeting why the roads were not being cleared. He received a warning letter about unpaid dues that he knew he had already paid. Every challenge was answered with paperwork. Every concern was met with threats. Certified letters started arriving across the neighborhood like clockwork. Late fees, compliance notices, warnings about liens. Marla had discovered that fear worked best when it looked official. The HOA sent out a mass email assuring everyone they were actively seeking professional snow services. The wording was careful, vague, and completely hollow. No company names, no timelines, no emergency plan, just promises that something was being done behind the scenes. Nothing was. Days passed. Then more snow came. Then more. The roads turned into rutted ice channels carved by the few people desperate enough to try driving out. Several cars ended up abandoned halfway up hills, frozen monuments to bad decisions. One night, someone slid into a snowbank so hard they could not open their doors. They had to wait inside the car until a neighbor trudged over on foot to help. Still, the HOA insisted everything was under control. What hurt the most was the silence from people I had helped for years, families whose driveways I had cleared before they even woke up. Parents whose kids I had watched wave from the bus as it passed my truck. Most of them avoided me now. Not out of anger, but fear. Talking to me meant admitting Marla was wrong, and admitting that came with consequences. I could feel the neighborhood shrinking, not physically but emotionally. People stopped checking on each other. No one wanted to organize rides or coordinate shoveling because it might look like defiance. The sense of shared responsibility that had kept Coldwater Ridge alive for decades evaporated under a stack of warning letters. I watched it all from my window. Every morning, I looked at the snow piling up and fought the urge to grab my keys. Every instinct told me to fix it. That was who I had always been. But every time I imagined Marla's phone pointed at me, every time I thought about another fine or a lion notice taped to my door, my hands stayed at my sides. The worst part was knowing this did not have to be happening. There was no emergency that forced these rules. No accident that triggered them. This was a manufactured crisis, built one letter at a time by someone who had never needed help in the snow and did not care who suffered as long as she stayed in control. By the end of that week, Coldwater Ridge felt like a place under siege. Not by weather alone, but by silence. And the longer that silence lasted, the more dangerous it became. The call came just after 5 in the morning, the kind of hour when your phone ringing already means something is wrong. I was still half awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind push snow against the side of the house, when my phone lit up with a number I did not recognize. It was the school district. The woman on the line sounded exhausted before she even finished saying her name. She told me the bus could not make it up Ridge Loop. The driver had tried once and backed down. Tried again and nearly slid off the embankment where the road narrows and drops into trees. Kids were already outside, she said, bundled up in the dark, waiting because nobody had told them the road was in danger. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Has the road been plowed? There was a pause. Then a quiet, embarrassed no. She asked if I could help. I closed my eyes. I explained, carefully, that I had been banned from plowing HOA roads, that I had been fined, threatened, ordered in writing to stay off Ridge Loop and every other private street in Coldwater Ridge. I could hear the disbelief in her silence. She thanked me anyway and said she would try to figure something out. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was a parent. Then another. Then 3 more. Voices layered over each other, some angry, some scared, some trying to stay calm for their kids standing out in the cold. They all asked the same thing. Could I please just clear the road so the bus could get through? I told them the truth. I was banned. Word traveled faster than the snow. The bus driver tried one more time. He made it halfway up the hill before the tires lost grip. The bus slid sideways, slow at first, then faster until it lodged at an angle across the road. Not crashed, but trapped. The engine kept running. The heater worked. But the bus could not move forward or back. Kids were stuck inside. That was when dispatch called. The dispatcher was doing her best to sound professional, but I could hear the strain underneath. She asked if I was available to assist with clearing access. I told her what I had told everyone else. HOA ban, fines, threats. She swore under her breath, apologized, and said she would note it in the call log. Then came the photos. Parents started sending pictures of the bus. Yellow paint against white snow. Hazard lights blinking weakly in the early morning dark. Children's breath fogging the windows. The hill behind it slick and untouched, like no one had even tried to make it safe. That was the moment the entire story snapped into focus for people. This was not about a truck being ugly. This was not about rules or aesthetics. This was about a single person deciding that control mattered more than access, and doing it in a place where access was survival. Marla's promises about professional snow services meant nothing now. There was no crew coming, no emergency plan, no one else with the equipment or the experience to handle that hill safely. The only reason this had not happened sooner was because, until she forced me off the road, I had been quietly preventing it every winter. Phones started ringing across the neighborhood. Parents called neighbors. Neighbors called the HOA. The HOA did not answer. Someone finally reached Marla. Her response was short and cold. She said the bus should not have attempted the route without HOA approval. She reminded them the roads were private. She said liability was not her responsibility. That sentence spread like fire. Liability. Not children. Not safety. Not common sense. Liability. Parents were furious now, but it was a different kind of anger than before. Not scattered. Focused. They were no longer asking me to fix it quietly. They were asking why someone with a clipboard had been allowed to shut down an entire community's lifeline. By the time the county helped coordinate a slow, careful evacuation of the kids back down the hill, the damage was already done. No one had been hurt, but everyone had been scared, cold, powerless. And once people feel that combination, they stop accepting excuses. That morning, neighbors who had avoided eye contact for weeks knocked on my door. They apologized. They asked questions. They wanted to know exactly what Marla had done, what she had threatened, and how far it went. I showed them the letters, the fines, the warnings, the certified mail. People read in silence. For the first time since this started, the fear shifted. It was no longer aimed at me. It was aimed at the HOA. And standing there in my driveway, surrounded by snow that should have been cleared hours ago, I realized something important had changed. The illusion that Marla was protecting the neighborhood had shattered. Everyone could see now that by banning the one person keeping the roads open, she had put children, families, and emergency access at risk. The mountain had not changed. The rules had not changed the snow. But the truth had finally surfaced, and once people saw it clearly, there was no way to shove it back under the ice. Every part of me knew I was not supposed to turn that key. My lawyer had been very clear the night before. Stay put. Do nothing. Let the HOA dig its own hole. Once you cross that line again, he warned, they will come after you harder than ever. I understood the risk. I understood the fines, the paperwork, the long legal fight that could follow. But I also knew something else. There were kids stuck on a mountain road because of a rule that never should have existed. I stood in my garage for a long moment, staring at the truck like it was daring me to choose. Snow creaked under my boots. The wind howled outside, pushing fresh drifts across roads that had not seen a blade in days. Somewhere up there, parents were pacing and children were waiting, cold and confused, wondering why the grown-ups could not fix something so simple. I started the engine. The sound filled the garage, loud and familiar, steady in a way that felt grounding. I did not think about fines or letters or liens. I thought about access, about safety, about how many times that truck had already done this job without anyone noticing. I did not clear everything. I did not touch side streets or private driveways. I did not make it easy for anyone to pretend this was business as usual. I focused on what mattered: the main access road, the stretch where the school bus had gotten stuck, the lanes emergency vehicles would need if someone called for help. As the blade dropped and the first wall of snow rolled aside, something shifted in the air. It felt like the mountain itself exhaled. People came out of their houses slowly at first, like they were not sure what they were seeing. Then more doors opened. Someone waved. Someone else clapped. A woman wrapped in a blanket held her phone up and started recording, not to threaten, but to document relief. It looked like a neighborhood waking up from a bad dream. I kept moving. The road began to take shape again, dark asphalt cutting through white. The hill that had trapped the bus became passable. The turn where ambulances always struggled opened up, just enough to breathe. Then I saw Marla's SUV coming fast. She jumped out before it even fully stopped, phone already raised, voice sharp enough to cut through the engine noise. She shouted about trespassing, about violations, about how every second I spent plowing was another fine added to my record. She stood right at the edge of the road, filming, narrating, trying to turn the moment into evidence. I did not engage. I kept my eyes forward and my hands steady. Arguing with her was what she wanted. Chaos was her fuel. I refused to give it to her. That made her angrier. She paced alongside the truck, waving paperwork, shouting phrases straight out of her bylaws. She told me to stop immediately. She told the neighbors to go back inside. She warned everyone that this would end badly. No one listened. For the first time, people did not scatter when she raised her voice. They stayed where they were, watching, listening. Seeing the contrast clearly now between someone clearing snow and someone filming it. When she realized she was not getting control back, she made her last move. She called law enforcement. I heard her say the words plainly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Trespassing. Unauthorized commercial activity. Private roads. She smiled when she said it, like this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. I shut off the blade and waited. The engine idled, humming beneath me. Snow fell softly again, settling on freshly cleared asphalt like it was testing whether this would last. Neighbors stood in small clusters, shoulders tense, bracing for what came next. Some looked at me like I was about to be arrested. Others looked at Marla like they were seeing her for the first time. The wait felt long, but it was probably only minutes. When the patrol vehicle finally came into view, the mood shifted instantly. Marla straightened, phone held higher, already rehearsing the story she planned to tell. I stayed seated, hands visible, heart pounding harder now that the choice was already made. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. I had crossed the line she drew, but standing there, surrounded by cleared road and watching kids finally being able to get home, I knew something she did not. Some rules are not meant to be obeyed. Some lines are worth stepping over, and no amount of paperwork could undo what everyone had just seen with their own eyes. The deputy arrived slower than Marla expected. tires crunching carefully over the newly cleared road. He stepped out, took one long look at the hill, then at the yellow school bus parked safely at the bottom, and finally at the stretch of asphalt I had just opened back up. He exhaled through his nose, the kind of tired sigh that comes from walking into a situation that never should have reached this point. Marla started talking immediately. She launched into bylaws and private roads and unauthorized activity, holding her phone up like it was a badge. She spoke fast, confident, certain that once the uniform showed up, everything would snap back into her control. The deputy let her finish. Then he turned to me. He asked one simple question. "Did you clear this so the bus could get through?" I said yes. He nodded and looked back at Marla. Calmly, firmly, no drama at all, he explained that HOA rules were a civil matter. Fines, disputes, permits, those belonged in paperwork and courtrooms, not on icy hills with children involved. Safety, he said, was different. Blocking access and refusing emergency passage crossed a line that no set of bylaws could erase. Marla's expression shifted, not angry this time, confused, like the world had stopped following the script she memorized. The deputy thanked me, out loud, in front of everyone. He thanked me for clearing the road, thanked me for preventing a much worse situation, thanked me for doing what needed to be done when no one else would. Then he left. Just like that. No cuffs, no warnings, no orders to stop. Marla stood there frozen, phone still raised, recording nothing but her own unraveling authority. For the first time since she moved to Coldwater Ridge, someone with real power had told her no. That moment changed everything. The story spread faster than the snow ever had. People talked, not in whispers anymore. In kitchens, on porches, over phones that had been silent for weeks. Neighbors compared letters, compared fines, compared emails that suddenly looked less like governance and more like intimidation. Then someone asked the question that should have been asked months earlier. Where was the snow removal money going? All winter long, Marla had been collecting special assessments labeled seasonal road maintenance. Every homeowner had paid. Some had paid extra after being warned about access issues. Everyone assumed that money was sitting in an account waiting to be used for plowing services. But there had never been a plow, no trucks, no crew, no invoices posted to the HOA board. A retired accountant named F. Harold Dunny volunteered to take a look. He had lived on the ridge since before the HOA even existed and had stayed quiet until now. When he requested the financial records, Marla delayed. When pressed again, she claimed the files were being organized. That was when the audit began. What it uncovered stunned even the most cynical people in the neighborhood. There was no contract for snow removal. Not current, not pending, not even attempted. The account that was supposed to hold the maintenance funds showed withdrawals that had nothing to do with roads, payments to unfamiliar vendors, reimbursements with vague descriptions, thousands moved without clear justification, no service, no refunds, no explanation. As the numbers were laid out, the picture became painfully clear. The ban on my truck had not just been about control or aesthetics. It had been convenient. As long as I was quietly keeping the roads open, nobody noticed the absence of real services. The moment I was forced off the road, the lie collapsed under its own weight. Marla stopped answering emails. Then she stopped showing up entirely. A special meeting was called to address the findings. She did not attend. Another was scheduled. She sent a short message claiming she was out of town. By the third attempt, her house sat dark, driveway untouched, snow piled high like it had not been lived in for weeks. Investigators stepped in after that. What started as an internal review turned into something far more serious. Financial misconduct, misuse of HOA funds, intentional obstruction of services after collecting fees for them. Each discovery pulled on another loose thread until the whole thing unraveled. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak now felt something else instead. Anger. They had trusted her, paid her, let her intimidate them into silence. And all the while, she had been treating the HOA account like a personal reserve, confident no one would challenge her as long as she held the paperwork. The irony was impossible to miss. She banned the one person who made the system work, and in doing so, exposed the fact that there was no system at all. By the end of the week, Coldwater Ridge felt different. Not healed, but awake. People stood a little straighter. Conversations lasted longer. Doors stayed open. The authority had flipped. The clipboard had lost to reality. And for the first time since this started, the mountain felt like it was finally pushing back. Once the audit reports were circulated, there was no spinning it anymore. The numbers sat on the page, cold and undeniable. Anyone who looked at them, even without a financial background, could see the pattern immediately. This was not sloppy bookkeeping. This was intentional. Invoices had been created for companies that did not exist. Others listed vague services with no dates, no equipment, no proof of work. Entire line items were labeled seasonal maintenance, with no explanation at all. Thousands of dollars had vanished in small, careful withdrawals designed not to raise alarms. Even worse, personal expenses had been quietly pushed through the HOA account. Travel charges, meals, home-related purchases that had nothing to do with roads, snow, or the neighborhood. Every homeowner had paid. Some had paid more than once after being pressured with warnings about access and safety. And not a single dollar had gone toward plowing. As the findings spread, the mood in Coldwater Ridge shifted from disbelief to fury. People who had stayed silent out of fear now felt something stronger than fear. They felt used. They gathered in living rooms, comparing statements and emails, realizing how many times they had been manipulated with official language and legal threats that never had real backing. A special OA meeting was scheduled to address the audit. Marla never showed. At first, she sent a brief message claiming a family emergency. Then she stopped responding altogether. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back unanswered. When someone drove past her house, they noticed the driveway untouched, snow piled high, no lights on inside. It looked abandoned. That was when things moved out of the HOA's hands entirely. The evidence was forwarded to the authorities. What had started as an internal financial review crossed into criminal territory the moment intent became clear. Collecting money for services never provided, blocking alternatives to hide the absence, threatening homeowners into silence while draining the account. Marla was found weeks later in another state, staying with a friend, trying to keep a low profile. The arrest was quiet. No dramatic headlines. Just paperwork, handcuffs, and consequences catching up at last. Back home, the HOA unraveled quickly once she was gone. Board members resigned one after another, some out of shame, others out of exhaustion. Nobody wanted to inherit the mess. Meetings were sparsely attended, then canceled altogether. Dues stopped being collected. Legal notices piled up with no one left willing to sign their name to them. Within months, the HOA officially dissolved. There was no ceremony, no final vote filled with speeches, just a filing processed and approved, ending the organization that had caused so much damage in such a short time. The private roads reverted to county care, the same system that had worked quietly in nearby areas for years. Plowing schedules became predictable. Emergency access was guaranteed again. No permission slips required. The change was immediate. Snowstorms came and went without panic. County trucks showed up before dawn, methodical and efficient. The fear that had hung over the neighborhood all winter lifted slowly, like fog burning off after sunrise. People stepped outside again. Kids played in snowbanks instead of being warned to stay close to home. Neighbors talked without checking who was watching. For many of us, there was relief. but also a lingering bitterness. The collapse of the HOA did not erase what had happened. Friendships had been strained, trust had been broken, people had been put at risk for no reason other than one person's need for control and money. As for me, I did not celebrate. I stood in my driveway one morning, watching a county plow roll past, and felt something close to peace. Not victory, just balance returning. The mountain did not care about bylaws or titles. It only cared whether the road was clear. Marla had tried to bend reality to her paperwork. Reality had answered back. Coldwater Ridge survived not because of rules, but because the truth eventually surfaced and the system that fed on silence collapsed under its own weight. Winter still comes hard to Coldwater Ridge. The snow does not care who runs a board or who holds a clipboard. It falls the same way it always has, heavy and unforgiving, demanding respect instead of permission. The difference now is that nobody confuses power with responsibility anymore. I still plow, but I do it because people need access, not because a committee says I am allowed to exist. The roads get cleared early. The hills stay passable. The mountain works the way it is supposed to work when common sense is allowed back into the picture. The school bus runs on schedule again. Kids wave from the windows instead of sitting cold and scared in the dark. Ambulances answer calls without hesitation. Seniors make their appointments. Neighbors stop and talk instead of slipping past each other with their heads down. The silence that once smothered this place has finally lifted. Sometimes, just before sunrise, I hear the scrape of a plow blade on ice, and it takes me right back to that winter. To how close we came to losing everything because one person decided control mattered more than service. How fragile a community becomes when rules are used as weapons instead of tools, and how quickly things fall apart when fear replaces trust. Coldwater Ridge learned the hard way that real authority does not come from titles or bylaws. It comes from accountability, from showing up when things get hard, from putting people first when it matters most. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because when an HOA stops protecting people and starts protecting itself, the community always pays first. And sooner or later, the truth breaks through harder than any storm.